should happen here, but it's time to get to the main act. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Nida Kirmani to all of you today. I think many of you know her already, but I was quickly go through what she works on and kind of her particular position within LUMS. She's an associate professor of sociology, as well as the faculty director of the Saida Gender Initiative, which, as you know, is organizing this and a number of other talks. So finally, chairing and moderating talks, will actually gets to present her work, which I'm sure is pleasant. Jay for her case. So one of the interesting things about Professor Gurmani's work is that she has worked on both sides of the border. Her dissertation work was in South Delhi neighborhood, and that particular research produced a book which from Routledge, which is titled Questioning the Muslim Woman, Identity and Security in an Urban Indian Locality. And in this book she explores the lives of Muslim women in this locality by focusing on their many complex intersecting identities in a particular spatial locality. For the last few years, as some of you already know from the title of her work, her research presentation today, she's been working in Lyari in Karachi, and she's been exploring issues of fear, violence, insecurity, urban conflict in this area. She's published a number of articles based on this research, and she's developing this in use of lines on the themes of gender as well, which you will hear about shortly. Besides these two areas, she's also published widely on issues of development, and in particular the intersection of development and religion. The title of today's talk, you can also see it up here, has changed slightly from what was advertised earlier. Can Fun Be Feminist? Gender, Space and Mobility in Lyari. So Nida will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity to comment and ask a question about this work. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Lyari.
Thank you, Ahmad. Thank you, Saida, for giving me the opportunity to share my work. And thank you all for being here. I know for most of you it's the end of for all of us who are in higher education, it's the end of the semester. And we're all tired and stressed and have exams and papers and marking, so I really appreciate it. I know that it's not easy to be here. And it's also a bit, it's really a privilege for me. This is an indulgence. I'm going to read you my paper. I hope that you don't mind me reading. It's just so that I don't lose my train of thought. And this is a work in progress, so I would really appreciate critical comments. You can be as harsh as you want. My students can have a field day. And I really would love some feedback, because this is kind of a thought experiment. So I can't say I will appear confident, but I'm not 100% confident about what I'm putting forward today. And so I hope we can think together about some of the ideas that I'm proposing. So the paper is titled Can Fun Be Feminist, and I'm just going to jump right in. The densely populated, multi-ethnic, and largely working-class area of Lyari in Karachi is one of the city's original settlements. This area has become infamous as the site of an ongoing conflict between criminal gangs, political parties, and law enforcement agencies for over a decade. And for this reason, Lyari has been labeled as one of several no-go areas in the city. But while these neighborhoods do become fearful spaces at times, neighborhoods in the area are also places of comfort, familiarity, and fun, aspects which often get overlooked in research on marginalized urban spaces, particularly in the global south. This paper explores the multiple ways in which women and girls experience and understand their part of the city, and in particular, whether or how they experience fun. I argue that focusing on the pursuit of fun and enjoyment can be an important way through which women push against and challenge patriarchal boundaries, even if these acts may not always fall squarely into the category of political resistance. Based on extensive district with a population of between 1 and 1.5 million, Lyari is one of the oldest, most densely populated and diverse areas of Karachi. Referred to by outsiders as the Colombia of Karachi because of its perceived control by drug mafias, Lyari has increasingly come to be known as one of the most violent and crime-ridden parts of the city, by the media and by law enforcement agencies. This has led to a sense of territorial stigmatization amongst Lyari's residents, who would rather refer to their area as Karachi Kima, or the mother of Karachi, marking their place as one of the city's original settlements, and also highlighting a sense of comfort associated with their area. Lyari's negative image stems partially from the fact that it has been home to a variety of criminal groups who have become increasingly powerful over the past decades. While like any impoverished urban area, crime has always existed in Lyari, the 1980s is cited as a period in which violence in Karachi as a whole increased as a result of the influx of drugs and weapons during the Afghan War. Drug use spread rapidly in Lyari during this period as knife battles turned into gun battles between rival groups. During the 90s, crime and politics also became closely intertwined in Karachi, with Lyari's gangs being supported informally by the Pakistan People's Party, which I've talked about elsewhere in my research. When I began my fieldwork in 2012, Karachi was emerging from a period of heightened conflict between the two major political parties, the PPP and the NQM, with a great deal of violence targeted against young Baloch men in particular, something I've also written about elsewhere. The following year, the concentration of the conflict shifted to within Lyari, as there was another split between rival factions of the gangs, which lasted for more than a year. Hence, during my first 5 years in Lyari, I worked mostly on residents' experiences of various kinds of violence in the area, including everyday experiences of violence, representations of violence, and resistance to violence. At the same time, one of my main purposes in conducting research on this stigmatized part of the city was to get people to start thinking about this area in a more complex manner. And of course, that's what most ethnographers try to do in their work. So I was trying to move away from only looking at this place through the limited and simplifying lens of violence. However, after every presentation I made on my research, people often responded by asking, "How do you go there?" or remarking, "Wow, you're so brave." Despite my best efforts, through my own focus on violence, I was reinforcing the very ideas that I had intended to problematize with my work. All of those other aspects of the area I was studying, the energy, the excitement, the warmth, the vibrancy that draws me there, remained silenced in my own research. Perhaps this is a limitation in my own methodology of writing, but this is also a limitation in terms of how researchers, particularly those studying cities in the global south, are often compelled to only ask particular questions and frame their research within certain limited categories. If one is writing about violence, how does one also write about all of those moments when violence isn't taking place? And if one is researching gender-based oppression, then how does one include all of those moments where women are neither being oppressed nor necessarily actively resisting structures of power? Turning one's attention to women's experiences of fun and enjoyment helps to complicate the reductive understanding of urban life, particularly in stigmatized urban spaces such as in Lyari. So why is fun significant? Sociology as a discipline has historically tended to focus on the negative aspects of cities as a result of industrialization, including overpopulation, housing crisis, poverty, and conflict. While the study of cities in the global north has diversified to some extent, studies of cities in the global south are often trapped within a framework of perpetual, almost apocalyptic crisis. This is particularly true for certain cities such as Karachi, which has come to be understood almost solely through the lens of violence. While this is tied to the fact that Karachi has experienced a relatively high level of violence as compared to other cities in the region, and while this research has shed enormous light on the dynamics of the conflicts that have taken place in the city over the past decades, this almost exclusive focus on violence has also led to a kind of pathologizing of the city as only being defined by violence, with political and ethnic violence receiving the most attention. While one cannot deny the existence of violence within the city, an overemphasis on violence also excludes other key aspects of urban life. This also doesn't help us explain the wider context in which various forms of violence exist. So apart from complicating the discussion of third world cities in Karachi in particular, in the context of literature on quote-unquote third world women, and Muslim women in particular, the narrative in general has been dominated by the image of the quote-unquote oppressed Muslim woman shrouded in the Studies of Muslim women, particularly those from less privileged classes, tend to approach women as victims of violence, desperately in need of rescue. This discourse is present in studies produced about Muslim majority contexts in the global north, but is also reproduced in the Pakistani context. Hence, as an upper-class researcher who is read as Pakistani, I am framed both as brave and altruistic for venturing into this most dangerous part of the city to help rescue those poor women. A focus on the more enjoyable aspects of women's lives in Lyari disturbs this very narrow, simplistic, Orientalist image, which objectifies women as passive victims of violence, of violent and backwards cultures, and of Muslim men. Though I've also focused more on the darker side of urban life, this doesn't mean fun and enjoyment were completely absent in my research previously. Rather, these aspects of everyday life were always present in the narratives that I heard from women in Lyari, and in my own subjective experience of the place. In my research on women's employment, for example, some women mentioned enjoying, not necessarily their actual paid work, which was often underpaid and unrewarding, but the aspect of being outside of their homes and having a little bit of breathing space, away from their often restricted families. For example, one of the young women I spoke to, Saida, who was in her early 20s, and worked in a large department store in one of the malls in an upscale area of Clifton, Dolman, made a point to show me a series of selfies she had taken in the break room wearing a bright red t-shirt and red lipstick to match which was part of her uniform. While we spoke about the harassment she experienced on the way to work and from disapproving neighbors and extended family, there were aspects of her narrative that exceeded the framing of my question, which included the fact that she actually enjoyed many things about her job and the freedom it afforded her, both materially and physically. Hence, the aspect of fun and enjoyment was always there, lingering in the background, peeking out from behind the violence and oppression, but it was obscured by my own limited lens. Apart from the importance of talking about fun just because it exists and because it complicates our understandings of cities and of women's lives, one of the questions this paper explores is whether the pursuit of fun and enjoyment can be thought of as a political act, and whether in particular it can be categorized as feminist. There is a long history of debate on the relationship between politics and enjoyment, for example by members of the Frankfurt School, which we discussed in class earlier today, who were critical of the relationship between capitalism and leisure and enjoyment. Following similar lines, Ahmad has critiqued the compulsion towards happiness, particularly in the global north, as one that is driven by capitalism, consumerism, and individualism. She argues that in such a context, being a feminist killjoy and refusing to buy into the compulsion of being happy is a necessary form of political resistance. Where North American and European feminist theorists have discussed the political potential of women, they have largely focused more narrowly on the experience of sexual pleasure as opposed to pleasure in general. So this paper takes a broad approach to pleasure and includes any act through which women individually or collectively experience enjoyment. I'm inspired in this endeavor by the work of scholars of the Global South who approach enjoyment as an important site of politics and resistance. I draw on the work of Nida Kirmani on Palestinian women refugees in Beirut, in which she argues that critiques such as Ahmad's against pleasure and happiness are geographically and temporally specific to the global north. In the case of Palestinian women in Beirut, and also in the case of women in Lyari, the pursuit of enjoyment is an important opportunity for collective conviviality in an otherwise challenging and often atomizing context, and hence could be read as a political act. I wrote should be read, but I'm saying could be read. In the South Asian context, you might be familiar with the work of Shilpa Patke, Samina Khan, and Shilpa Ranade in Why Loiter. So they've written about the experience of loitering, hanging out with no purpose, as an act of resistance by women in order to claim public space. They mention the importance of women having fun in particular in a manner that is non-productive, non-consumptive, and involves taking risks as a political act. In particular, they talk about the importance of women occupying public space in a non-productive and non-consumptive manner, and in a manner that involves women taking risks. And they refer to this definition of fun by Asif Baya, which I also use as well. So fun is an array of ad hoc, non-routine, and joyful conducts ranging from playing games, joking, dancing, social drinking, to involvement in playful art, music, sex, and sport, in particular with speaking, laughing, appearing, or carrying oneself, where one breaks free temporarily from the discipline constraints normative obligations, and organized power. I'll let you read the rest yourself. Hadke Khan and Renane subsume fun under the broad umbrella of pleasure and argue that pleasure, quote unquote, undermines the very possibility of order and control. In a society in which ideas of propriety are often centered on controlling women's movements. Hence, women having fun, especially in public spaces, is often viewed as threatening because it challenges the notion that women's presence in public is only acceptable when she has a purpose. In the following section, I focus on a selection of episodes of fun and enjoyment that I observed while spending time with young women in Lyari, in order to explore further the potential that fun holds in terms of challenging gender norms. This paper approaches fun and enjoyment through James Scott's notion of infrapolitics, which refers to small, everyday actions of refusal and resistance, and argues that these small acts can also have wide-ranging effects on the organization of power relations. However, this does not mean falling prey to the allure of what Nida calls the romance of resistance. While the pursuit of enjoyment can both purposefully and inadvertently push the boundaries of dominant gender regimes, and hence be classified as feminist resistance, this is not always the case. Building on a small but growing literature on the political significance of happiness and enjoyment amongst women from marginalized groups, I argue that the pursuit of fun and enjoyment are who assisted me with this research, said that women in her neighborhood hardly had any fun in their lives. She complained about their lack of freedom, the restrictions they faced from their family, and the constant judgment that they faced from their neighbors. Issues that young women from across the city and across the country face. However, when I spent time with Sana in her neighborhood, the picture I saw was quite different from the one she narrated to me. Yes, women were not visible in public space as much as men, and yes, they were constrained by various social restrictions, but once we entered the narrow gullies, there were lots of women and girls loitering in front of their houses, chatting away and smoking hookahs. They would also go up to the rooftops to escape the heat of their cramped living quarters during the frequent power cuts that plagued most areas of the city. This gave women a much-needed break from their household responsibilities and a chance to congregate and catch up on the neighborhood gossip. Apart from these everyday moments of conviviality, women would use the opportunity provided by religious festivals and rituals to also get out of the house and enjoy, something that others have also worked on. A visit to a shrine, for example, would provide women with a legitimate reason to take a trip out of the neighborhood or the city and enjoy an outing. Furthermore, like the Carnival in Rio, the month of Ramzan would provide a relaxation of social norms, which women seem to enjoy the most. While neighborhoods were virtual ghost towns during the day, the streets were transformed after sunset into a party-like atmosphere, particularly as Eid approached, a phenomenon that is common across most non-elite Muslim neighborhoods across the region. For women in Lyari, Ramzan provided a legitimate excuse to go out with their friends and female family members in the neighborhood, often under the pretense of shopping, but more often just to go out wandering around almost as flaneurs, enjoying the sights and sounds of the streets. Very often, the pursuit of enjoyment is something women, and young women in particular, did on the sly, in ways that were sneaky, or using the spaces available within accepted norms in unacceptable ways in order to create space for themselves to find enjoyment. Thus, not openly challenging restrictions, but using spaces within the bounds of accepted social norms to their own advantage. For example, which is something many of you know, in many Muslim majority contexts, women in Lyari also use the veil strategically in order to increase their mobility, and at times get away with things that might otherwise be deemed controversial. Women also push the boundaries of cyberspace through a type of virtual veiling. For young women in particular, social media is opening up a platform to explore different sides of their identities and different types of relationships. However, it is still not acceptable for most young women in Lyari to have Facebook accounts. For the minority who manage to access social media, they do so in secret, using a pseudonym and never publicly sharing their own photo on the platform. So they'll use, this is one example from somebody that I know. They often use their accounts to initiate conversations with various people, make friendships, have discussions, and often flirt. Social media and mobile phones have in fact transformed the way that young women communicate, or young people communicate, find romantic partners, and have fun in ways that are a constant source of anxiety for members of the older generation, a thing I think many of our students probably are very familiar with. While access to technology is still limited, it's more widespread in working class urban localities such as Lyari than one might expect. and is radically transforming social relationships and opening up new possibilities for the experience of enjoyment. So one of the experiences I'll narrate is this experience of going on a picnic with some of the young women that I knew from the vocational center that I spent a lot of time in Lyari. So one day I went on a picnic with a group made up of largely women students between the ages of 19 and 25 at Vocational Training Center, which provides low-cost or free classes to young people in the area. There were about 25 of us on the trip, and we took a day trip in a coach 2 hours outside Karachi to the area of Tata to visit several tourist sites. When I arrived at the center in the morning on Sunday, most of the young women were quite dressed up for the occasion in highly colorful shalwar kameezes. Dressed in my own everyday wear with comfortable sandals and hardly any makeup on, I was conscious that I looked quite shabby in comparison. Although on normal days most would be wearing a black burqa, very few were wearing them today. One of the women, however, never took off her niqab throughout the day, and the rest of us kept laughing at her for taking selfies while still wearing her niqab. But she was only exceptional because she took selfies with her niqab on. Otherwise, most of the day seemed all about taking selfies in every possible spot. In the bathroom, in the restaurant, when we stopped to break our journey, in the bus, and even in and around one of the shrines we visited, which the girls got scolded for by one of the caretakers, but which hardly stopped them. A few of the young women also got scolded by older male strangers for not dressing properly over the course of the day, at the shrine and then at the mosque, which they just shrugged off. After all, these guys really didn't have any power over them. There was a freedom these young women had when they were away from their own neighborhoods. They really didn't seem to care what people were saying or thinking about them, which wasn't possible when they were closer to home. They also seemed to be relishing this freedom. This was most apparent when we went to Karachi, which was full of families and groups of young men who had come to spend the day playing around in the water, sitting in tents by the lake, eating, listening to music, and generally enjoying themselves. Here you could just see the young women reveling in their freedom. When we piled in for a motorboat ride around the lake, Arisha, who teaches a beautician course at the center, kept standing up, spreading her arms out, and screaming at the top of her lungs with joy, attracting a lot of attention and not really caring about it. When we visited other spots, Arisha would flirt with random guards and police officers in a way that she could never get away with in her own neighborhood. On the way back on the bus, we were all singing and dancing in our seats and breaking out periodically in fits of laughter. No one seemed to want the day to end. Some of the women kept asking the bus driver to stop at Aladdin Park on the way home, despite the fact that we were already going to return much later than expected. The enjoyment of dressing up and taking selfies was clear over the course of the day. One could argue along the lines of Abu Dawud that this kind of enjoyment reinforced a restrictive and gendered consumer culture that places pressure on women to conform to particular beauty standards. At the same time, this could also be viewed as an important means of self-expression for these young women in a context where women's sexuality in particular is constantly policed and controlled. Secondly, the reason why the young women from the vocational center were able to let loose was because they were away from the prying eyes of their own neighborhoods. This gave them the freedom to take off their burqas, dress up, laugh out loud, flirt with strangers, and generally be irreverent. This provided a break for these women from being constantly surveilled. While this did not necessarily challenge gender norms within their own context, it was precisely the exceptionality of this event and its geographical distance from their homes that allowed for the possibility of the freedom to enjoy. While the young women on the picnic were in some senses challenging gender norms, they were doing so away from the prying eyes of their family and neighbors. These momentary suspensions, though exceptional in some senses, may give these women the confidence to push boundaries when they're back home in their everyday lives. Once they've tasted freedom, they might not be willing to give it up so easily. On another day, I had a conversation with two young women, Samin and Maham, about what cycling means to them. So this is the second kind of episode. Samin is 19 and Maham is 25, and both work for a community organization called the Lyari Cafe. So that's the photo that was on the poster, that one of them actually took. The Lyari Cafe started organizing bicycle rides every few Sundays last year, which was a deliberate effort to claim public space for women and girls. This echoed the efforts of another group, Girls on Bikes, which has organized similar rides in Karachi, Lahore, and Islamabad. However, while Girls on Bikes was mostly made up of upper-class women enjoying when it comes to women asserting their agency and their right to occupy public space. It's also simply a source of enjoyment. When they first started their bike rides, the members of the Lyari Girls Cafe were met with resistance from the local branch of the Jamaat Islami. And although they still reportedly faced a great deal of harassment, over time they were able to carve a space for themselves. More recently, Samin and Maham have started taking their cycles out, just the two of them, which they found both nerve-wracking and exhilarating. While Samin's family did not mind her cycling, Maham would have to sneak out of her house early in the morning to avoid being seen by her disapproving male cousins. I spoke to them about why cycling was so important to them. Samin, first of all, we stay fit by cycling, and the second reason is that we have found a solution to the pollution problem through cycling. There's a lot of pollution, and what is important is that when we cycle, we feel a sense of freedom. We come very close to freedom, and in the fresh air early in the morning, we really like cycling then and feel empowered. And we use the word empowered, otherwise this is translated. And often we hear people say, Lyari isn't defense. So we say, even if we go to defense, what will be different there from Lyari? We say, we want Lyari to stay Lyari. We don't want to make it defense. Amen. If girls are cycling on the streets, why are you saying it is like defense? And so I respond, and girls don't actually cycle on the street in defense. They don't even walk on the street there. So it means if people say this is Naya Pakistan when they see us, the Bili Aage. And someone else said, Baji, you are a girl, you aren't a boy. Why are you cycling? And I said, Hi, why are you cycling? This sport is for girls now. As compared to the picnic, there's much more conscious articulation of resistance in these women's narratives. The young women at the Lyari Girls Cafe were deliberately and consciously challenging gender restrictions through the act of cycling. While many of their justifications could be read as attempts to legitimize their behavior in socially acceptable ways, like talking about pollution or health, there was also an explicit articulation of a feeling of freedom and empowerment when they cycled, which demonstrated the inextricable link between their pursuit of enjoyment and their assertion of their right to the city. The fact that they were doing this in their own locality under the disapproving gaze of male family members and neighbors underlined the boldness of this assertion. At the same time, while they at times cycled in their own neighborhood, they mostly preferred to go to other neighborhoods in Lyari or in the area just outside of Lyari, in which there was more open space. And they did so really early in the morning, when there were relatively few men hanging out on the streets. Also, most of the members of the Girls Cafe who went on the cycling trips were actually quite young, which you can probably see in the photos. So they're not older women. As restrictions on dress and mobility increased after girls crossed puberty and approached what was considered a marriageable age. Maham also snuck out of the house early in the morning when her male cousins were asleep. Hence, in this case as well, there's an aspect of maneuvering around gender restrictions rather than challenging them outright. Like the women at the picnic, Samin and Maham managed to find ways of experiencing fun and enjoyment by strategically navigating within, around, and pushing back against the gender restrictions placed on their mobility. So, to conclude, while women and girls find opportunities for fun and enjoyment in multiple spaces, in the gully, on the roof, at their neighbors' houses, in the mall, at the market, in the shrine, and in the virtual space of Facebook, WhatsApp, and now TikTok, which I love, the common thread seemed to be that most often fun and enjoyment happen for women outside of their own homes. This is unsurprising given the fact that for most women, home was the site where they faced the most social restrictions from their male and elder female family members. For the vast majority, the further one traveled from home, the more freedom one had to challenge gendered codes of behavior. Hence, controlling women's mobility was also key to preserving the gender order. Returning to the original question, were these experiences of fun and enjoyment any more than a momentary break from an otherwise repressive environment? And did these episodes hold within them the possibility of transforming gendered power relations? While it is true that women's experiences of enjoyment often took place during exceptional moments or in secret, and despite at times feeding into gendered consumers' desires, these moments can be viewed as providing openings for women to push back against rigid gender codes. Jameson has argued against the moralizing critique made by some within the left of pleasure as a justification for capitalism. Rather, he sees the allegorical potential of pleasure as a means of imagining the quote-unquote systemic revolutionary transformation of society as a whole. While Jameson is speaking and not referring to gender relations per se, one could also extend this argument to the potential that enjoyment holds for the transformation of the structure of gendered power relations. At the same time, in focusing on fun and enjoyment, one should be careful not to slip into romanticizing the lives of poor and working class women, which are fraught with very real restrictions in terms of their mobility from their families, communities, and society. For example, Saima, the woman who is working in Hyperstar, has since left her job because her fiancé and his family wouldn't accept the fact that she was working in such an establishment. Sami, or Mamam, has resigned from the Lyari Girls Cafe and has stopped cycling because she said she needed time to focus on her studies. But her colleagues told me that she had actually likely left due to pressure from her family. And the members of the Lyari Girls Cafe were, at the time of writing, facing a renewed offensive on social media from the local religious party, the TLP, for tarnishing the image of Lyari as corrupting local women and girls after they received coverage through a video made by Al Jazeera and because they went on Aurat March. Hence, even the limited spaces that women claim for themselves in order to experience any kind of joy in their lives are constantly under threat. It is also worth noting that much of what I have described in this paper in terms of how women have fun isn't unique to Lyari or Karachi or even Pakistan. One thing that is particular to Lyari is the fact that such opportunities wouldn't have been there during the period of heightened conflict when the mobility of all residents was restricted. This was the case regardless of gender, and my earlier research focused on restrictions faced by young Baloch men. However, for women whose mobility is already restricted, the conflict meant that outings without an explicit purpose, just for fun, would be much less likely to have occurred. Hence, it is only since 2013, when a paramilitary operation was launched in the city as a whole, and violence, at least at the hands of non-state actors, subsided, that one can see the resumption of social activities in Lyari and the opening of spaces such as the Lyari Girls Cafe. Finally, focusing on fun and arguing for a more complex understanding of marginalized urban spaces does not mean ignoring the issue of violence. There is no such thing as a violence-free urban space. And the imagination of such in security discourses tends to produce new kinds of violence. Rather, like fun, violence is always a part of everyday life, whether it is the memory of past violence or the imminent threat of future violence, and whether it is physical, structural, or symbolic in form. As Waheed has argued elsewhere, sometimes violence itself can be a form of having fun. In an economically deprived area such as Lyari, which has experienced almost 2 decades of violence at the hands of multiple actors, and in the lives of women who constantly face the threat of violence in their daily lives, one cannot forget the fact that violence exists. However, focusing exclusively on violence puts forward an incomplete picture, including an analysis of other aspects of social life, such as experiences of fun and enjoyment, provides a more complex picture of the richness that constitutes everyday urban life, and highlights the multiple ways in which women creatively negotiate within, around, and against various spatial and social boundaries, thus allowing space for the agentive possibilities of pleasure to emerge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I've been hearing about all these enjoyable experiences of families. I think it was coming on its way, right? That you actually theorizing this really interesting paper. So you can open it up for questions, comments, thoughts. Make sure I can see you by looking here as well.
Well, I really liked it. It's super humanizing, and so it's quite different than, exactly what you were saying at the beginning. It's unlike anything I've read about Pakistan before, so I really appreciate that. And you wanted to be published so I can say many people will appreciate that. So I think it's really good. The emphasis on fun, and I don't know why I've not been confident about it, because that's fabulous. But yeah.
Maybe I can start with a question about the body. The many examples that you provided us with in terms of how women are using fun and enjoyment to challenge it seems that the body is quite central to that. Whether it is the young woman on the boat ride who sort of expressing her freedom, or it's obviously Mom and Sabine who are cycling. So I was wondering if that's a particular lens which you approach the experience of fun. Like what does the fun, having fun do to the female body that then acts upon these sort of certain structures of gender norms and so on. Yeah, that's
Thank you. No, I think that's a really good point, and one that I could think about more. The only way that I think I mentioned the body was the importance of, or the risk of women putting their bodies in public space, and the fact that that kind of disturbing a woman's body in public space being perceived as dangerous was also liberating. But a lot of these activities are about actually the physical experience of the body, and I think that could be one way in which I could build on the theorizing, the embodied practice of enjoyment as well, because certainly it's important.
And perhaps folks like Lefebvre and Risotto who talk about their everyday in terms of the body. I think forces and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so I really enjoyed your argument, but there was one thing that didn't come into my mind. So your argument was very catered to one sort of persona of females that the image that was coming to my mind was very easy, that it was very common, were girls that were ready to throw off the burqa. But what about those that were not, as you said, I think, oppressed by the burqa, but empowered by the burqa? Now I know that you might find this odd, empowered by the burqa, but I actually, when I was in Karachi, I had a very distant family friend who was actually from Lyari, and she, at the age of 17, she got married and she had 2 children. Obviously for me that was just like, what is happening to you, and you must be really sad. But what she said to me was, I'm actually quite happy, and that was something that I found extremely surprising because she had no formal education. And I was like, how are you happy, with where to live in India, and how could you be happy? She said that with these sort of responsibilities, with having a household, with having these responsibilities, I find enjoyment in this, and that was an aspect that I found was different, because you usually think that no, they must always be existing. And yeah, and other than that, another person that I talked to who was actually my neighbor in Karachi, and she used to come we used to live in North Nazimabad, and she used to come all the way from Lyari to North Nazimabad. And then I used to, obviously I was very interested in this, right? So I used to ask her, do you like, coming here and looking at us? And then what the answer that she gave to me was, no, I would rather stay at home. So how do you, where do you find it? Where do you see these women having fun? Because they do not want to, challenge. They're okay with being restricted. They have kind of internalized it. They don't see a problem with staying at home. And there are a lot of other women too that I talk to. They are completely okay with their mother. They say that, protect me.
I think you've understood the
Mushtaq, yeah. So I think I mentioned, I'm certainly not arguing that we need to take the burqa off to have fun. And I think I mentioned the fact that occupant women will use the burqa as well strategically in order to expand their options in terms of mobility, whether it's to work, whether it's to meet people, whether it's to do something that might otherwise be considered unacceptable. So the burqa is something that, depends on who's using it, how they're using it. There's certainly I'm not arguing you need to throw it off in order to enjoy yourself. But the other point about how do we decide what is fun and enjoyment is, if there's, what one person's definition of enjoyment is very subjective. So if there are women who are saying, I really was at that and I don't want to leave the house. So that's something that perhaps one needs to think about more in terms of whose idea of fun and enjoyment are you prioritizing in this analysis. So are you, and like I said in the paper as well, that there are some ways in which the act of enjoyment enjoyment and fun can also reinforce certain kinds of gender hierarchies. So I'm not saying it's always something that's necessarily challenging. I'm just talking about how fun can disturb that binary between always challenging or conforming. And this might provide a different lens of trying to understand how women are negotiating their everyday lives.
You've got two questions.
Yeah, I don't have a question, I just have an observation. Like you were talking about your body occupying your body in a public space. So I just wanted to share some findings from the program I initiated called Women on Wheels. And when we were interviewing participants, we found that some of them, when they basically rode bikes in public spaces, would dress up as men and would basically wear helmets and sort of bypass the harassment that they have to face on a daily basis. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
How they wear helmets to bypass their harassment?
I mean, they would like, what do you think about it? Like, they're still navigating the public space, they're still sort of asserting their right to a public space, but at the same time, they're hiding their body and pretending to be men, right? So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's that same kind of strategic navigation that women are always doing, trying to play within the kind of restrictions that are there in creative ways. Still pushing. So just being out there, maybe there are times when it's revealed that it's a woman, maybe there's times where it's concealed. But this kind of playfulness is kind of what I'm trying to bring out. And women are doing it everywhere, not just here, you can see it around us all the time.
Thanks. So I have two questions. The first has to do with how you should frame the creative part of the paper and the episodes that you draw on. So the two episodes that you discussed, there is an element of an institutional intervention that allows for something like this to happen. Right? There is a vocational training institute, and then there is this writing language. And both of them are sort of informing the episode of fun that you're creating. So I was wondering if there is, you must have encountered this in your conversation with others. The arenas in which it's more diffused than there existing this sort of intervention by an organization or by sort of a collective of some sort. So what are those some more diffused aspects of fun? Some that you've talked about, maybe sort of expand on those. And the second one, and this was actually quite interesting, you mentioned about how social media accounts are something that people are also using to explore sort of other aspects of their identity. Did you find anything interesting on how those sort of platforms allow for the formation of relations outside their neighborhoods? So interactions with people, cross-gender interactions in particular, that also falls as sort of something that comes to mind. So basically.
I think one of it's not a coincidence that I've focused on these two more institutional episodes. I do think that these kinds of new centers that are opening up do provide unique opportunities for young women to actually push even more, to find more spaces to be able to do this. So women being able to, for example, go to Audit March on their own, I think would have been very difficult. So the fact that there was an institute, there was a bus organized, there were people there, so that all facilitated that kind of political expression. And also the fact that going out in a group is just easier. Of course, there are more diffuse ways that I mentioned, going to festivals, different kinds of outings, Ramzan. In everyday life, you'll find that. But I think that these kinds of spaces that have opened up in the last few years, like there's boxing clubs as well, these are relatively new, and I think these are providing young women even more opportunities to push values because of that institutional protection that they're getting. And the second So I'm wondering if you can see fun. Obviously, gender is key, and I'm not trying to take it that way, but you can see fun generally as an act of like whether it's subversion, reframing, hacking, it might come across a lot of other dimensions. And I don't need to address passenger, but I'm wondering if we can separate fun out of the category of, it's not, again, I don't want to use resistance word, because that's how I love that, because maybe there is, in all the moments of fun, if you look at humor, like, what's funny about humor is that it's not expected. So it is level, right? So fun and sharing more. That's like a question as well. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about it, and I think it's something I kind of want to talk to you more about. Age as well, I think, definitely, the women I'm talking about are all in their early 20s, late teens, early 20s, that time right before you get married. And marriage is a huge, changes things a lot for these women. So it's often, not that women stop having fun after marriage, but the nature of enjoyment probably changes for a lot of these women. And the restrictions on their mobility become much greater. And then as women get older, more power in the family unit. As they get older, so it's like this kind of, where they kind of, over time then become more powerful again, depending on the circumstances. But certainly this is one particular subset of the population. Older women are, of course, women of all ages are enjoying themselves in different ways. These kinds of activities that I mentioned are particular, I think, to this mode of enjoyment, or modes of enjoyment are really particular in this time period, especially isolated, especially about bodies. Yeah.
You mentioned that most of these examples actually, they were examples of women maneuvering around gender restrictions instead of outright challenging them. So wouldn't that just count as just them having fun as individuals rather than fun as felons?
Okay. So I think with most of the examples that I mentioned, there is some, and this is something that Lyari also mentions in her work, the importance of collectivity, like the fact that women are actually collectively enjoying themselves. There is something unique about that, that perhaps might add the feminist angle to it. Not to say that individually one can also. So there is a kind of collective aspect to it. And that was a question that I raised, was this maneuvering around, does it in some ways, and this is a question that comes up with conversation, especially on humor as well, is that does humor, or does fun, by subverting, but not necessarily challenging, always, actually reinforce? And I'm coming out down on the side of this paper of it mostly challenges. And that's what I said, there is a discomfort in my own work, but maybe that's okay too, because life is also ambiguous. And so to say that fun is always feminist might be a stretch. And sometimes fun can also fall into certain kinds of gender codes of behavior. So a lot of women talk about having fun at weddings. Dancing. You have time during a wedding where you can dance, where you can dress up, you can express yourself in a way. It's kind of a suspension. But again, it's also reinforcing a certain kind of heteronormative, patriarchal institution. So is that really reinforcing, or is that really challenging anything? So that's another kind of example that came to my mind, where are there times where it actually just reinforces the gender order?
I was thinking of most of these answers that you gave in terms of fun as well. I think after your question as well, it kind of resistance or non-resistance subversion, I think it also becomes that because there is this element of transgressing this certain space of reality in all of these episodes, right? Like every
conversations, right? And not the mobility part, but you're focusing on. So I was thinking again about examples and also about where you work this, which are kind of see about your own characterizing, your own sort of selection of case studies. I remember I think I saw a photo earlier in the presentation about not mobile, but he was sitting down and they were like, something like right. And I was thinking that you don't really sort of address. It's an older crowd. And it could be actually examples of the kind of things they might be doing. It would not be sort of overtly kind of doing things that qualify as feminists. But then there are, and I think now your own work, right? So for example, one students that in sort of these everyday, ordinary activities that on the surface don't really have any kind of feminist agenda, but there are possible ways to understand them through different lens. And like you said, they are also connected to producing, which, in many cases are how it works. Oppressive also leaves certain openings for others. Other questions?
Just following up on that. In the cases and definitely conversation, there's something about sort of going out, right? So I mean, it's not just the neighborhood, but then going out from Lyari, going to some other place to have fun. So liking outside of that. So I'm trying to sort of, I haven't come across a lot on it, but I'm trying to understand how to conceptualize boundary enforcement that moves beyond just the household. But then is the neighborhood then an extension of the same sort of, is it a kinship sort of arrangement? And then you have some other space that exists on top of that, which provides you with a potential arena for exploring yourself or sort of going out. So what is the role of Lyari in this then? What role does that space actually play? Is it the space that you're contesting, or is it a space that provides some pockets in which you can sort of break out from the household, which is something other than, I guess, locus of the oppression of women?
Yeah, so I think the gully is also an extension of home in many ways. So the whole kind of, which provides women with a certain sense of freedom as well. Because women don't necessarily have to veil in the same way. They don't have to wear the burqa, even if they're outside of the home, as long as they're in the gully. Because it's all considered to be an extension of the home in a way. That also provides more restrictions as well. So I don't know if Lyari is the boundary that is relevant, or it's just a kind of, the more distant you get from the space of the home, the more opportunities get opened up. And the interesting thing is, gully se agar phir aap bahar nikalte hain, then you have to kind of veil in a particular way. And then if you leave Lyari, the further you go, the more you actually can let go of certain things as well. So it's not linear. It's interesting to think about how women. So Ramzan when I was there last Ramzan, we left and went to Karachi to go and sit on the rides and have whatever snacks and just enjoy ourselves, because they didn't feel comfortable doing that in their own immediate neighborhood. So Karachi was just across it's just like a 10-minute walk. In Gumse, they felt really free to be able to kind of enjoy themselves more openly. And that can happen between neighborhoods in Lyari as well, where you could go to a different neighborhood and be able to relax, because at least your neighbors or extended family is probably not there.
I'm not really well, so maybe also there. But in 19th century when rural migration happens in Europe, there's a lot of anxiety about women and unwanted children in the streets. Also for things like you don't really admire social workers and kids on this anxiety and working class women and things like that. And so the whole idea of the city becomes an enterprise of how to The same thing, I mean, if you look at some of the things like pregnancy and all, we always find this respectable woman, and we sort of, both respectable, but one is not, from within the Ashraf household, she has the true Lyari and the Lyari, these women, and then you have somewhere from Calcutta, sort of late 19th century, again, performers, the street workers, the women from the unattached women, and the city, right? The city creates all these sort of chaotic moments where the female body and also the younger child becomes a problem of chaos and needs to be managed. And this sociology is a product of that. But so that's one history, and so some of that, as you say, sort of happens in places like Karachi, or as well, like if you look at memoirs with he and Ramin, they would stand in front of original house and look at, and they don't even say that. They actually say they were in Georgia, Punjab University, so they would just stand out there and do works, right? And they would sort of women were in the 50s and 60s, and then slowly and gradually those spaces become restricted, and so forth. This middle class. And it's a long-winded kind of saying that in Karachi as well, where it is much more homogenous, there is particular, and now in Asad Bukhara, Bulgaria has become very homogenous. The whole of history of the last 20 years has also created very circumscribed, ethnically circumscribed spaces. In all this, and I think you all, and I think you all disagree, you also talk about how women have fun in private spaces and weddings and songs and all this kind of various kind of rituals. But there's also pleasure, like my friend was saying, I'm from Karachi and not another. So I can resist that. So that some people don't want to work because work is not fun, right? But the idea of going on that diet or just being in the mahalla, getting to whether it's heterosexual or not, getting to sort of flirt or getting to getting to know someone who is prohibited in your ethnicity or sort of seeing each other in your way not there because you're sharing an apartment building which is just one bathroom on the ground floor and you come out of the washroom and he's coming in, These are very small kinds of pleasures.
You should write a screenplay.
So what I'm trying to say is that the notion of fun is not a criticism of going to the promenade, going to the sea, going to the opera, going to the cinema. It's a particular kind of construction of fun from a modern city. And I think we have to also start thinking that there are other ways in which the notion of, I know artists, we don't know artists, what are they? So I'm just wondering whether the other kind of, like Saida Humanities work on working class on town workers outside Toronto. She talks about, very interestingly, that these are mostly town women, but they start having affairs with cinema ex-soldiers. Right? And there's a whole sort of economy of various kinds of magazines and things like that. So I'm just saying that working class labor girls and then going to work in matchbox factories or shrimp factories, so there is always sort of various kinds of ways in which people get to do things and have fun, or just run away and flirt with the conductor or something. I'm not saying that this is, I'm just saying there's a certain kind of over-emphasis of a certain kind of middle class morality in which you are not, but in our mind, we put it a burden on the poor that they have to become like us. And I'm trying to work with
Which I really like the quote about, your defense mechanism. It's kind of, why do we have to be like that in this imagination? I mean, the men are using defense as this way of saying, okay, this is a kind of dangerous modernity or liberalism, which is a fiction. And these women are subverting it and saying,
I think that we always think about a lot of women in the middle class neighborhoods and defensive living have all these women trying to get themselves. What's all that about? So I'm just trying to push the boundary. There is a pleasure of being from home. So I'm just trying to push the boundary lines. They pick me up.
he's going to blame the
I stopped there. I've gone on too long. But this is it just got involved because of your way or something.
We'll take one more question. this one?
Well, you don't have to.
So people ask the questions of what fun questions fun learning, what those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a kind of, I think the paper is also trying to subvert the idea, this very middle class idea of what fun is and what, how these women's lives should be and how should they be having fun. And maybe the examples I used are a bit more traditional in the sense that they're cycling or they're going on a picnic and so on. But in the earlier part of the paper, I did mention the going to work actually, even if it's an underpaid, and you're exploited at work, and you hate that part of your job. That can exist side by side with enjoying going, with enjoying the journey, with enjoying the time away from home, with enjoying wearing the uniform. And you can feel all of those things at the same time. And so I think it's this idea that we always have to fit people into these boxes of what it is to be poor, what it is to be a woman, what work should be, what oppression is. We should always be kind of resisting this kind of oppression. But you can do that, and you can also do a lot of other things at the same time.
Please join me once again. Thank you for